to the WiLD conversation where human being and human doing converge, reshaping the world of leadership, culture, and performance. Today, I get to have a wild conversation with our founder and CEO of WiLD Leaders, Dr. Rob McKenna. He is a renowned expert in leadership development, celebrated for his groundbreaking work in fostering trust, driving performance, and connecting business strategy with the human side of development. Dr. McKenna has over 2 decades of research and practical experience that position him as a thought leader in crafting sustainable, people centered organizations. He's collaborated with organizations such as Boeing, Microsoft, Heineken, and Alaska Airlines, bringing a combination of approachability, authenticity, and expert knowledge to every engagement. And today we get to have a conversation about the WiLD methodology, what I like to call the WiLD way. Rob, it's good to be with you today.
Always good to be with you, Sabbath, too.
You always say that both method and measures matter. Tell me why it's important for leaders to understand that if they're to build trust on their team and in their organizations and build up whole leaders, why method and measures matter.
Early in my career, actually, when I was studying, there's an area called program evaluation. People are attempting to use great research to evaluate the effectiveness of programs. Something that I learned early on was a description of something called the black box. And when you're evaluating the effectiveness of a program, what most people don't think about on a day-to-day basis is that when a program either succeeds or fails, and by the way, if you're someone who has gotten funding from a government agency or from a foundation, oftentimes they'll want to know did the program that we funded, did it work in the work that you were doing? And so this black box is this way of understanding program effectiveness. And it affected me early on in my 20s as I was getting trained as a program evaluator. One of the pieces of that stuck with me all these years is that programs, we often think they fail because they just failed. There's more going on in most of those stories than that. The full reality is that programs often fail for at least one of two reasons. One reason being that the theory behind what the program was designed to do was flawed. So in some cases, they designed a program based on some theory, some psychological theory, some training theory, that could be the reason why the program doesn't work or does work. It could be a flawed theory or actually an effective theory. Like, for example, that certain kinds of coaching conversations done a certain way will develop and get us the outcomes we're looking for. But the other reality is that sometimes it's not because the theory was flawed. We could have the best theory in the world, but our implementation was off. So we don't even pay attention to the data that might tell us that the implementation could be something as simple as our emails didn't go out because they all went into spam when we invited people to participate in the program. I mean, literally, it can be that simple. So there are these issues of either theory or implementation. And so I think that got me thinking early on in my career that it's not just about assessments. Because you know that we're a business that has a full menu of whole leader development assessments and trust building assessments, which we'll get into, I imagine, in just a little bit. But it's not just about that it's not enough to just begin to assess or to have people understand their strengths or their competencies or how they behave or their personalities. That's not enough to get to all the different kinds of things that we hope for. And so when we think about this, our WiLD methodology, it quite literally is a revolution in the way you think about what it means to develop leaders and to build trust. It is because it is so different than what is normally done. And we see many calls out there for that. It's one of the reasons I think that we hear from people who've been through a lot of leadership programs where they feel like, in some cases, unfortunately, it felt like a waste of time. It just didn't feel like the program met them where they are. And so why that's important to me is because we know there's a lot of things we should be leaning into that we know work. And so just to give that a basic framework for the rest of our conversation is we describe that, it's not just our measures, which is a critical part of what it is we do, but it also includes a mindset, a methodology, and those measures. And what I mean by that is that we all know and we all bought into this concept that our mindset matters. And what I mean by that is the way we think. The way we literally place things in our brain matters. And for the most part, we have embraced this need to develop a growth mindset. Now, we also know that we also need to maintain a performance mindset because it's not just all about learning. It has to be our learning connected to our performance. But in the past, we haven't done a good job of inviting people to shift their mindset. That's so critical because everything that I will share with you regarding the method is really not just about mindset, not just about your thinking, but it's also inviting a shift in that thinking and then also a shift in what you're actually doing. And there's an interesting connection between those two things. So the mindset is the first thing, is like we're embracing a wild mindset, which includes a growth mindset for sure. The second part is that there are certain things you can do in your method. In other words, the way we interact, the way we either interact with each other or the way we interact with processes or tools or assessments that matter. And so that's what a lot of this conversation is about, is like that method, like how do we interact together and with other things? And then finally, measures. Measures matter. That's the content of the conversations that matters as well. But it's so important for us to think about our method. The way that we structure interactions matters and makes a difference.
Yeah. And these things are at play in every interaction that we have as a team with another organization that we get to work with. And we get to the end of our time with them, and they can't quite figure out what just happened. They just know they've experienced something revolutionary, like you mentioned. They don't know why it was so engaging. They're not sure what was happening inside of them, except when we make them engage with what's happening inside of them. And then by the time we've come to the end of whatever time we've had set aside together, there's transformation because of all of these things that we purposely set up. As a participant, you're not always thinking about, what am I thinking about? How am I thinking about it? Why am I thinking about it? I'm just doing what they told me to do. But we've done that thinking. You've done that thinking, and we
Yes.
implement it into all of our interactions. There are a lot of moving parts in the WiLD methodology. We're not going to go through all of them in this conversation. We might continue it at another time. But tell me about seeing people whole, for the whole of who they are. Of course, WiLD stands for whole and intentional leader development. So we have to start there.
As I'm commenting on these things, I'm gonna be moving between mindset, method, and measures because they really are integrated. And so the methodology can invite a different mindset, and the measures can invite different kinds of behaviors based on then what I'm seeing and measuring. And so when you one of our big fundamental things is seeing people whole, which is a an invitation to a different mindset that so often in our world we're drawn to very quick one-off solutions. And I understand that, like simple matters, but we're drawn to these kinds of things. And then the challenge with those one-off solutions, and so it's, for example, I assess myself and I get to know my personality. For example, you pick your whatever kind of assessment or kind of framing that you want to pick, and this concept of seeing people whole it's the way I picture things because I've been involved in enough research, and most of us have just, this is just a no-brainer because we know it's already true, is that when I look at you, Sabbath, because of the background I have as a person who has studied whole leaders, I know that I am 99.999% sure that you have a whole story that's more complex than a one-off moment, that your story is more than what you're good at, that your whole story, seeing you whole, means that there are many different variables that are going on in you that include your competence, your motivations, whether or not you feel supported or alone right now, whether or not you're making an investment in other people and you're making that sacrificial kind of choice to do that, whether or not you're learning from your past. You know, understanding I already mentioned this, but your competence alone, like that's just one piece of your developmental puzzle. And for example, the other thing is that purpose we know is a critical piece of who Sabbath is, but it's not the whole story. And so what's cool is when you begin to see people whole, you're actually seeing them in their natural habitat.
Yeah.
This is where they function every day. And seeing them whole doesn't mean you don't deal with those pieces individually, because it's a lot, right? You can't tackle that all at once. But to understand, and then it's not just about those different pieces of your development. Seeing you whole from a whole and human perspective means also a full awareness, not necessarily awareness of the details of this, but awareness that you have both, it's a tough word, but brokenness and beauty within you.
Yeah.
I have yet to meet a human being who does not understand that within themselves, they have both brokenness and places that are lacking, and they have incredible capacity and are doing incredible things and are doing beautiful things in the world. But to see a person whole as a human being is to embrace both sides of that equation.
It's an invitation to do that not just for others and the people that we're working with, but first for ourselves.
Yes.
And honestly, in my experience, that has been one of the hardest places to see myself whole. It's easier sometimes to see somebody else whole, and sometimes not. It takes no virtue to point out the faults of others. It's an invitation to see the beauty and the brokenness within ourselves. All of those parts that you mentioned that are a part of our Wild Trust platform for a
Yeah.
reason. We say start at the top. Tell me why.
So I hear this still all the time today. We talk about the concept of senior leader buy-in. Buy-in means that the senior leader is sponsoring, usually financially, whatever the initiative is that's going on. And when it comes to learning and development and performance, we have seen that we have got to have the most senior leader involved participating in the process. And I use that word participating very intentionally because it's not about just modeling. It's easier to embrace, okay, if I do this and I'm a senior leader, then I am modeling a behavior that I want other people to do. Now, that's true, but it's not the real reason this is so critical, this concept of starting at the top. It's because in most cases, when it comes to your whole leader development efforts or your trust building efforts, that senior leader is going to be a core piece of solving that puzzle. And it's going to happen anyway. I got so tired, Sabbath, of doing programs just because literally I had very senior leaders in very successful organizations when they defined why they're going to do a leader program. It was literally at one point someone said, because it's what we're supposed to do. And I'm like, not compelling.
Yeah, they're checking a box.
They're checking a box. And so we in most cases will require that the most senior leader is participating. It does, that modeling does impact other people. So if someone uses the skills and knowledge inventory, this assessment of my competence, my expertise, if a team or a complete organization is going to use that, there is nothing more powerful than the CEO saying, let me tell you what the skills and knowledge inventory told me about myself in terms of my strengths and the things that are areas for development for me that are key in my role right now. There's no doubt when that happens, it does invite that same level of vulnerability for everyone else. It does.
Yeah.
But that's not the primary reason. The primary reason is that leader has got to be learning and growing.
And that surprise, surprise is not always
Right.
received well.
Yeah.
And it's not the norm, which is why, again, it's a whole leader revolution. It goes into another part of our methodology, which is we develop together. We create spaces for honest conversation.
This one is for me a triple, maybe quadruple hit. So you solve multiple things at one time. One of the things to embrace in a WiLD methodology is that your attempts to develop leaders, to develop teams, to develop your organization, make it more effective and to help it perform, create value, and your efforts to build trust are integrated. They're integrated. And this particular point in our methodology, this we develop together, is so critical because a lot of times with leadership development programs, and I'll use little quotes around that, we oftentimes we put people in a vacuum of their learning, and this works. This is good with other leaders maybe who aren't even on their team, which is important and can work.
Yeah.
But imagine if you're taking that learning that's taking place inside of a person regarding all those things I just mentioned, and you put people together to begin to talk about it. Now the double dip is you are solving your development of your leadership bench, which most people are very interested. I have to have great leaders in my organization to function into the future. And at the same time, when they start to talk about it together, now they're learning and growing together. And there is nothing more catalytic
Mm,
than that process of bringing my awareness of these different lanes of my development, which I bet you're going to have a question about in just a moment. But when I'm bringing that and I do that together, when you and I as team members say, here's how I'm developing as a leader, let's talk about this. Am I on? How are you developing, Sabbath? Where do we have gaps in our team? Is
yeah.
where that starts to happen. And the reason why that's so critical is like when I first developed all of our tools and assessments, like most tools and assessments that are out there that are one-offs and a person takes some assessment, learns something about themselves. That's traditional leadership development. That's the way it's still done today in too many cases. But when you start to share that learning together, it is catalytic it's like a nuclear in an amazing way shift in the way learning spreads and grows within those individuals and then between them is such a powerful thing because we learn together. We have to. We don't function
Yeah.
in a vacuum. We don't do that in our marriages. We don't do it in our teams. We just don't.
Yeah. There is so many ways we could go from this. There's the way we ask questions, the way that, like you said, our learning and performance are aligned, the way that you connect job to development. What are you working on right now? And what does it have to do with what you are learning right now? Tell me about part of our methodology that gives them their learning back. So it's not that you're just having these honest conversations and you're asking the right questions, but what is it that one step further about giving them their learning back?
There's a combination of things you just mentioned that are a part of this giving them their learning back. I've yet to meet a leader who does not want their people to take their own responsibility for their own learning and growth. We really have failed to really give it to them to say I'm going to resource you to do this. Now I would say this is like and expect you to do it. I'm not saying like it's just by invitation and just whoever signs up. How do we have organizations where we don't expect people to learn? If someone said, I love the job, I really love what the organization is doing, I think I can do the job. Not really interested in the development part that you all do. I know you have a regular cadence of development conversations where you're learning together and it's connected to the job and our performance, but that's not that important to me. What would we say to that person?
I believe we would say there might be a better fit for you somewhere else because our rhythm as a company is to learn alongside, to edit and grow together. If we can't all be all in that process, we can't function if not everybody is in it for that learning and development consistently. Consistently,
Yeah.
we are always changing. Every month, there's a new conversation to have in the WiLD Trust platform. And every month, we learn something new about ourselves and we learn something new about each other in the process. If somebody you're trying to get things done with isn't along with you in that journey, how are you going to get things done together
Yeah.
if you don't know each other?
And can I give you one little example of how we give them their learning back? Is that in the design of our structure of assessments. So it's like life-changing stuff, right? In the design of these 10 different developmental assessments, we've often been asked over the years if the organization says let's say we're gonna gather a bunch of leaders together and they say like, can we print their feedback reports and
Can I review them before we have our time
yeah.
together?
And we just say no. Think of what happens in the mind of a person that you're trying to invite them to take ownership of their own development. Our development is a wild, wild territory. It is a crazy space of amazing potential, but also a lot of things I haven't figured out yet. And so, as
Mhm.
someone is using an assessment, if they believe that I'm looking over their shoulder and they believe in one of the simple ways is that if they think that, oh, you can print my feedback report, so that means you can see my feedback report, it will limit their capacity to own their own development because it will shorten the whole story of what it is they need to narrate or score in different assessments. to get real. And so that's one of the ways we do that is to make sure that the person understands your responses, your feedback reports, they're all yours.
Building trust in your business starts with being able to measure it so that you can create a pathway for change. Our WiLD Trust Index measures the drivers of trust at the personal, team, and organizational levels. We are building the largest database on the drivers of trust inside of organizations. This survey will inform growth imperatives and the necessary organizational change needed to fuel that growth. For more information, visit wildleaders.org, click on the WiLD Trust platform, and get started with the WiLD Trust Index today.
You will continue and you will open up and be sharing more and more as you go. But you need to understand that these are yours. So things you need to say and communicate in writing or to assess is yours until you're ready to get it out of the oven, is the thing that you've heard me say before.
It's not an easy, natural thing to do. We aren't by human nature going to write down our gut response and be honest even with ourselves. Back to that, we have to see ourselves whole first. So we invite that strategic vulnerability, and oftentimes it's not until the second or third year through that someone actually believes no one's looking over their shoulder, and they begin to, like you say, crack the door on vulnerability. It
Yeah.
takes time and intentionality and repetition to tell yourself, no one's looking over my shoulder, and to
Yeah.
trust yourself enough, and then trust your team enough to say, I'm going to write this down. I can share what I am comfortable to share, what I'm going to let out of the oven, and I hold on to the things that aren't ready yet. And there's
Yeah.
that space, that paradox of team and personal trust that meets somewhere in that. I love how you said it's wild territory. It's like it's this terrain, and you move into different parts of the terrain of your story. And sometimes it's dark and rough, and sometimes it's smooth and lush and green.
Yeah, and you mentioned another piece of the wild method that's so critical for us, and we describe it as focusing on the one with an eye to the many. One of the organizational realities that anybody who has built an organization or been a part of it would quickly understand is that we start off, as solo practitioners. We start off with an idea, and then as we build, then we get surrounded by others who like the idea and they join us on the journey.
Yeah.
And then as more and more people join us, and we call that first thing a team, right? So now we've got a team of people doing this work together. And as we scale and grow, then we have multiple teams.
Yeah.
And we start to drive that way. And when we say focus on the one with an eye to the many, one of the things that we've missed historically has been that when we start to scale, we are forced to systematize and organize. The tension that we sometimes lose sight of is that as we systematize and organize, we can very quickly lose sight of the person, of the individual.
Yeah.
And when we do that, if we lose complete sight of the individual, we really have lost our soul. However, if we lose sight of the organization, we've lost scale. And without scale, we can't grow our impact. So, would we rather sacrifice scale, effective scale, or our souls? And I would say neither. How can I feed the necessary resources to the soul of a person
Mm-hmm.
if I don't have effectiveness at scale? So this focus on the one of the eye to the many is a forcing yourself to see and accept the tension between the needs of the one, and as leaders, we cannot ignore the needs of the many, which is an organization. And the needs of the many will oftentimes be solved at scale by systems. And so really just making yourself say, I'm going to hold on to both. And the challenge is what we do is we default to one of the other or the other too often. Like when we see messages that the future is all about empathy. It's not true. It is about empathy, but it's not all about empathy. You know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
embracing that focus on the one with an eye to the many is just what I encourage leaders every day.
What I love about what we've built inside the Wild Trust platform within this methodology is the reality that there is a set of assessments of curated conversations, and we can let the assessments do the work because what we need in our souls, as you described it, is different. But if we let the assessments do the work, then we don't have to hold that someone else's soul. The assessment will bring it out and what they're ready to share and talk about and work on together will come out. So tell me about how we let the assessments do the work.
You know, you're feeding my soul asking these questions. Um, so for anybody out there who is saying, I want to develop whole leader capacity, I want to build trust, we built assessments for those things. It's a whole leader development process. And it's important to understand that and say, what if I could move my leader development efforts from this piecemealing together a book club and a all hands seminar and a, you know what I mean, on the latest fad and all those things. And I said, I was going to make development a strategic imperative by putting assessments in people's hands. Because imagine assessments that assess your competencies, that assess your motivations, that assess the strength of your network and your support, that assess your purpose and your calling, that assess your readiness and your personality. Like that's what the WiLD Toolkit does. And what too often happens, we piecemeal together a process, and especially this is so relevant in coaching, where coaching is oftentimes a default towards one way where it's like whatever the person's story is, just whatever it is fine, without a lot of direction or structure. And it makes it very difficult for the coach, by the way. Some of you coaches will know what I'm talking about, where wide open coaching for some can be a little bit stressful unless you're a very mentoring type of coach where you're giving a lot of advice. You're probably not stressed at all. You're like, I'm wired for this. But we talk about this, that when you're using tool-based coaching or assessment-based coaching, like what's in the WiLD Trust platform and the WiLD Toolkit, you're using these assessments. A person has this incredible feedback report that's telling them there's data about their story. There's qualitative, there's a story behind the data in that. What's so amazing is that you can measure your effectiveness as a coach by whether or not you are feeling like you need to be providing the energy for that conversation. And the power of these rigorous assessments that are so approachable at the same time is that they do the work for you because they're giving the person all this data that's coming from them to bring into that conversation. So we
Yeah.
say one of the metrics for whether or not you're letting the assessment do the work. So imagine someone comes in and they've used the motivational drivers inventory, is whether or not they're talking more than I am. That person being coached should talk more than I do. I should be there to invite out the questions and the just the meat of what is in that for them to learn from in that particular assessment. It's providing incredible data for them to reflect on. But if I just let the assessment do the work,
Yeah.
but making sure that you're allowing the assessments and the story to come out of that person so you're not robbing them of their best thinking and learning. That's
You're
right.
asking a question and you're letting the tool and the work that they've put into it bring that answer out.
Yeah. So, Sabbath, I'm going to turn this around on you. You know our method. Tell us, why is it important to see development as a long play? It's a core part of our sort of statement of method, right?
I hear you say focus on today and tomorrow. And we've heard that from some incredible guests we've had on the podcast as well. And it goes back to seeing yourself and others around you as whole leaders means what we're doing today in this moment is impacting the long haul. And if we don't take what we're learning today and implement it, but also with the long play in mind, realizing it's not going to change overnight. Whatever perfection we're trying to achieve is not going to happen overnight. And it's going to perhaps be painful. That's why we have to see the long play, is because it gets hard. It's not
Yeah.
easy work.
Yeah.
It's not easy conversations. It's
Yeah.
not loving everything you have to do, but it's developing in the moment and along the process. And then as you focus on today, you say, okay, I am doing this work so my future self is going to thank me. And also for the generations that are coming after me, we do
Hmm.
work that will begin with us. It may not end with us. We might be a part of something, like you say, often that we're not going to see the end of. And that's why being intentional about seeing development as a long play is bigger than us.
Yeah. And it's true, isn't it, that when we focus on the short term alone, on this moment, we oftentimes will default to emotional responses
Yeah.
that don't engage the other part of our brain that needs to be a bit more logical about what's occurring. And when we step back from that moment and say, it's okay if so and so is frustrated with me, that's a big statement, right? because in the moment it
Yeah.
doesn't feel okay and I want to fix it right now.
You
But when
wanna fix it right now.
yeah,
Yeah.
and when I step back and I say this is a long play, I'm less likely to react based on what I'm feeling.
I can sit in this tension
I can sit in it.
because I know the outcome for the long haul.
There is one other piece, Sab, this importance of understanding your strategic moment
Mm,
related to this connection between performance and learning. Like, why is it important for people to understand their strategic and missional moment, like what it is they're trying to get done,
yeah.
as they connect that to the learning of their people?
In stretch moments within the work that we do, I'm talking about like work, like I have XYZ to get done today. And it might not be my ideal situation. It's going to stretch me to get it done. In those moments, the more that I understand what I do bring to the table and what I don't bring to the table, then I have an opportunity to reach out and have somebody help me in the stretch. But if I'm not aware, if I just get stuck in the fact that this just feels too hard, I won't be able to see what's happening right now, the strategic moment that is actually stretching me. I just will blame so and so for not giving me enough instructions, or I will blame the technology because I can't get it done fast enough. Or I'll just start to blame all these outside influences instead of realizing, okay, this is a moment for me to figure out what I'm working on, how it affects the team, how it affects the organizational mission, and what do I need to do to get me moving ahead. But it's all of that, all those things happening at once, which
Yeah, and
can be a lot.
as human beings, we will more often than not default to performance, whether we're doing it well. And I get that people say like you are not defined by what you do. That's actually only half true,
Yeah.
because what we do, and there's good research around this, affects who we are. So the things that we actually put into practice are good or bad habits. I think very few of us would deny that those things affect even possibly our character. And so we default to that performance, that getting it done. We all want to make progress, right? There we wish we could. And so it's such a critical part of our WiLD methodology is to begin there. It's okay for you to identify what it is you're trying to get done. We call that your strategic objective. Like, what is it you're trying to do? And that's okay, but you can't stop there. Because now, once you've identified that, and the way this comes up in practice in our methodologies, every time while if we're working with a team, we will begin that process with what are you trying to work on right now? What are you trying to get done? And now when I open up a conversation about what you're learning, what's happening and changing within you, and we start to have that conversation together, we're actually getting a more whole story. But so oftentimes we'll leave off the learning or we'll disconnect it in some way where it's so far from the actual activity of what I'm trying to do that I can't make that connection. But when I can do that in real time, and we call that real time leader development, it's so critical. And so it's why we can't work with a whole organization unless we understand their strategic moment. Now let's talk about how learning and trust and what's going on psychologically inside of your people in between them. Let's talk about why that's important.
Yeah. And why having a system and a rhythm and a process to bring all of those things together into a conversation is powerful. It's a
Right.
masterful moment to bring it all together.
That's right.
As we wrap up, tell me about seeing the story behind the scores.
When we see scores about ourselves, it's one of the reasons that when people take assessments, they oftentimes will see it like a test, right? So it's like, am I getting the right scores? And I would say measurement matters. Like having data, which is the nature of the tools that we built and the assessments we built, it's not just data, it's not just your story, it's both.
Yeah.
And we somehow have defaulted over the years to separating those two things or focusing on one or the other. And we would say in our method that scores matter because measurement, if I can see data, even literal numerical scores, that it gives it's as one of our guests said recently, it starts a conversation,
Yeah.
but it also gives you an assessment of where you are. So that matters. But
Yeah.
one thing we say at Wild all the time is pay attention to the scores. When someone says to me, "So what's a good score on the leading under pressure inventory and the pressure profile, Dr. McKenna?" And I'll say, "That's an important question." I would say, on that particular one, I'd say trending upward on both. Your scores are hopefully trending higher.
Yeah.
But just as important as the scores, just as important is the story behind those scores. That the story, the qualitative story that you're telling, all the words that describe the number and the context around the number, it's why we call it contextualized measurement, creates so much power. Like it blows people away because they've never done that before. They've
Right.
seen they've seen journal entries, they've seen storytelling as this big emphasis without measures, or they've seen measures and metrics and they've gotten their color or their special label of an animal or whatever it is that they use as this moment, but then they don't have the story. And
Yeah.
there's always a story, there's always a context. So when you do both, we maintain that tension again of doing both. Golly, the power of connecting those two things together is incredible.
What does someone do? They've heard our wild methodology. They see a need for whole and intentional leader development within themselves, within their team. Where do they begin?
We would say start by assessing trust in your organization. And the reason why is because you probably know you need to do that and you can measure trust. But the other cool thing about that is that it identifies trust is probably it's the most important currency in our organizations. And when you begin to see its makeup, like what it's actually made of, you realize that you're not just assessing trust, but you're assessing the moment your leaders are experiencing, their needed development. You're assessing how people are interacting with one another. And it gives you a measurable way to see that measure, but also engage in the storyline because every organization has its own story. And that's what we do. But then I would say you make learning a strategic imperative. So we no longer treat it as something that our training department does as a one off moment or something that's separated from the business of our work. We make it a strategic imperative. So it's setting a structure and a rhythm for conversations with a structure. So that's what in our case we use the WiLD toolkit, these different assessments that we are building leader capacity. And then when we talk together about all these different lanes of our development, incredible things begin to happen in terms of performance, in terms of decisions we're making in our organization, and in terms of developing our bench. So we're like triple dipping on this process. So you make development a strategic imperative, meaning that person who comes and interviews for WiLD Leaders, if they're like, yeah, not really interested in that, that we would be assessing in that interview process their readiness to learn and to grow and to see the invisible and to lean into our methodology that we use on ourselves as well as with everybody else.
Thank you, Dr. McKenna. Rich conversation about the wild methodology. Thank you for listening to this Wild Conversation podcast. For more information, visit wildleaders.org, click on the Wild Trust platform, and get started with the Wild Trust Index today.